Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer. Welcome to the virtual CISO moment. Sheryl Benedict joins us today. She is a PCI QSA and information security compliance expert. Sheryl, thank you so much for joining us today.
Appreciate it, Greg. It's my pleasure to join this session today.
And I really appreciate you jumping in to fill a slot that came open just at the last minute because the other person had a web camera issue, which does happen. So thank you for coming in at a moment's notice. And as we always start, I'd like to hear about your journey, your career journey, how and why you got into information security,
Mhm.
cybersecurity, and then just take us through to where you're at today.
Great questions on those. As far as my career goes, just what I started in business administration, majoring in computer information systems, I got into that degree program in California, and just being able to identify, what I wanted to get into. We actually had to complete electives within the computer information systems program and identify kind of what career path we wanted to go in. We had four different choices within those career paths. One was information systems, database administrations. We looked at network administrations. We also looked at web design, as well as the programming development, and then also subsequently an auditing career was also one of the other electives, which intrigued me. Initially, I got into programming and actually did quite a bit of consultative work even before graduating college. Just kind of getting into that space, getting familiarized, working with customers and clients, and identifying what those business requirements were. I was very early in my career, but just knocked it out of the park with a nice small consultant business, and worked on a major implementation for a very large commercial real estate company.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of kick started my career, getting into that space and working with clients and being a consultant. Uh, Also, just looking at that auditing career, you know, once I kind of felt that, I wanted to switch up things and take a look at auditing. IT auditing was one of those items where I was trying to figure out what the space was, what it was all about, and understanding just one portion of that, like from being a programmer and how to make systems secure, is one of those key areas that most organizations sometimes struggle with, and you have to guide and advise them uh, with that knowledge and expertise within IT auditing, or even compliance for that matter. There's so many compliance regulations that are out there these days: privacy, PCI DSS compliance, in the
And
federal
and
space.
the CMMC rule as we're
CMMC,
recording today, it was just
exact.
released. So
Yeah, CMMC for the federal and government contracts, things like that. So there's so much out there these days. There's so much learning opportunities, and just being able to learn and grow day after day. Learning is never, you never stop learning.
right.
Every time I'm always out there just trying to learn something new, getting into different areas, getting into cryptography and encryption, and understanding how that applies even in web applications, and just some of the payment security devices, and understanding how that is implemented.
Hmm.
So that's just one of the areas of just how I got into the space.
And I can verify, seeing as I'm 102 years old, it feels like sometimes that yes, and never stop learning as well. Um, I'm not much for certifications, but I've talked about this before on the podcast. That if I see one that has meaning for me, and I will go for it. And I evaluated earlier this year the Security Studios Certified Virtual CISO because I saw it as a potential to help out in the space. But I know that one of your certifications is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as we said in the intro, you are a PSI QSA, right?
Yes, I'm a PCI QSA. I'm certified in performing PCI compliance assessments, both on the self-assessment questionnaires, as also performing reports on compliance as well for various organizations, both
And
merchants and service providers.
And so QSA stands for what?
Qualified Security Assessor.
That makes a lot of sense because we like acronyms in our field. Everything has to be an acronym. And PCI, it's actually PCI DSS, right? And so
Right.
expand that out. What is
So
that?
with PCI DSS, that stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards.
Ah, I was almost going to say digital security standards. See, I get tripped up a lot as well too. Now, normally, Sheryl, at this point in time in the podcast, I'd love to ask what, from your perspective, is the most significant threats, one of the most significant threats to small and mid-sized business in the InfoSec or the cybersecurity space. But I'm going to kind of short circuit that a little bit because you're one of the most knowledgeable people that is in my sphere. As far as PCI goes. So I really, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about PCI because that is a major, I wouldn't say a threat per se, but a lot of times businesses struggle with meeting the standard. And of course, we all know that compliance doesn't equal security, but you need compliance to be secure. And you can go back and forth, chicken and egg. So if you don't mind, if it's okay with you, I want to talk a little bit about PCI. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent. Because if you had said no, I don't know what I would have done. It's like, oh, okay, thanks everybody for joining. Stay secure. So, so my first question is, and I struggle with this sometimes, is I go to the PCI Council's page. I think that's what it's called, and I'm trying to find a succinct definition of what a merchant is and what a service provider is. And
Mhm.
I have a pretty good idea, but can you explain to us from a business pragmatic standpoint what they are and what's the difference and why there has to be a difference?
That's a great point, Greg. As far as I'm going to try to simplify those definitions to make things a little bit easier to understand versus the PCI Security Standards Council's definition of those. So,
Yes, which can be like a whole bunch of stuff that I get glassy eyed, just reading it. So
exactly. So typically with merchants, for the definition of a merchant is typically could be a small, could be a large, medium, large size business, could be a small mom and pop business like a coffee shop. It could be also a small grocery store, that a very small city might run and accepting credit cards there for their grocery stores. It could also be home improvement stores. You got the big box stores, you got Lowe's, Home Depot, Tractor Supply Company, even just a bunch of other organizations that are out there. Being able to accept payments as far as being a merchant goes. So that's just one of those areas. You've got restaurants; those are also considered a merchant. Within being a service provider is a little bit different, and there are some cases where you can be both a merchant and a service provider. You could be providing a service to a customer. It could also be, for example, I've always worked in this industry for quite some time, and some of those situations where I've seen that is, you work with a hotel. You're going to a hotel and you got a valet station there, and those valet stations, in some cases, they might be outsourced to a third party. That third party, it would be, depending on how the merchants are set up from your bank, that would be kind of determining who is owning that merchant ID as far as being able to process payment cards. If the merchant ID is under the service provider side, obviously that would be as a part of the service provider requirement. So the merchant ID would be the pretty much the merchant, like the small, medium businesses, mom and pop shops, things like that. For service providers, that would be obviously taking a look at those services that are provided to third-party customer. Some of the common ones for service providers are Amazon. Amazon has multiple services, both at the merchant level, because they also accept payments for e-commerce, but they also provide services to third parties. So they're considered both a merchant and a service provider in some cases there. So
So
that's one of those interesting items there I wanted to share for you.
so if I'm a small business and I have, I'm going to do a little visual here because I happen to have it out here.
Mm-hmm.
I have a little, I should have gotten this done beforehand, but hey, it's right here. I have a Square reader,
Yes.
credit card reader, and I sell books because I'm an author, as you can see behind me on the screen. That's the information security for small and mid-sized businesses. I got the plug-in, that's good. But I'm out and I'm selling books, and I take a credit card with the Square here. I'm a merchant, correct?
Yes, correct. You
And
are a merchant.
Square is the service provider in that relationship.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, let's talk about in the banking industry. Let's just say that you have a bank that is, they offer cash advance, so they have a POS machines in their branches. That would make them a merchant, correct?
Yes, that would be a merchant for that case, for those cash advances, for those point of sale systems. Mm-hmm. Correct.
And what if they are a card issuer, like if they issue debit cards with the Visa logo on it? Would that make
Right.
them a service provider?
As far as those goes, as far as being that would actually be considered as a service provider. But there's a different requirements for different types of services. There is a specific requirement for PCI card issuers. There's separate guidance that you must also follow for being a card issuer, and different security measures and protections that also need to be in place for that.
What would that guidance be?
Yeah, so that guidance would be the card production security assessment as part of the PCI security standards information there. So you would work with one of those qualified individuals with the company that would actually perform those services and actually assess against those PCI standards.
So if there's an institution that actually that produces these cards,
Mm-hmm.
then they need to engage a QSA to, or is it dependent upon level of transactions?
As far as that goes, there's a couple of points to those questions. Your first question was just, obviously looking at the different levels of compliance. So
Mhm.
when you're looking at levels of compliance, there's level 1s through level 4. Each card brand has their own specific PCI requirements as far as obligations or reporting requirements go. So if you're, for example, a level 1 merchant or even a level 1 service provider, even level 2 as well. Looking at the transactional volume, and each card brand has their own specific requirements there. But typically, if you're over like a certain threshold, I think it's like 2 million or something transactions in a given year, you must comply, obviously with the level 1 requirements, which require engaging a qualified security assessor and performing an assessment against the PCI DSS version 4 requirements, and it's 4.0 at this point in time.
So if I guess I get a little confused sometimes between like the levels. I understand with the merchant, and I understand the levels there, but part of me, how I read what I see on the PCI page, council page,
Mm-hmm.
has led me to think that is there just uh, one service provider self-assessment questionnaire, so that let's just say you don't reach that level. I know that for the merchant, there's like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different SAQs. That's a self-assessment questionnaire for the acronym challenged out there. But for merchant, for service provider rather, if they don't reach that threshold where they need a QSA, is there only one SAQ, or am I mixing things up here?
No, you're not mixing things up at all, Greg. As far as those go, obviously there are multiple SAQs out there, but there is only 2 different items where you can complete an assessment for a service provider. One is obviously engaging a QSA company to work on, if you're processing a very large number of transactions, you'll complete a report on compliance and attestate and go through an attestation of and receive an AOC or attestation of compliance at the end of that. Also, if you're a smaller service provider, depending upon your acquirer or other customer obligations, they may ask, obviously, completing a self-assessment questionnaire. You could be a level 3 or level 4 service provider. And then from that standpoint, there is only one self-assessment questionnaire that service providers are able to complete, which is the SAQD for service providers.
Now, what if I'm sorry for peppering you with questions, but this is fascinating. I'm loving this. What if the service provider, okay, so the service provider, I'm thinking about card issuer again, the card issuer, that relationship, they would know about the transaction volume and would let the financial institution, for example, know that they would need a QSA, or is that something that the financial institution would be tracking on? I guess what I'm asking is there an automatic check from the Visas and the MasterCards of the world as far as transaction volume goes?
Yes. As far as those transaction volumes go, definitely go to each of the brands' websites and look at their requirements for PCI compliance. Each of the brands, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and JCB. I think there's also UnionPay nowadays. But each of those brands have separate requirements as far as transaction volumes go and what those reporting requirements would be. If you're a service provider, obviously, that would, be determined obviously by mostly the card brands, and they would let you know as far as what those transactional volumes would be. You would also, always also work with your acquiring bank, as far as understanding what those requirements are, and they can provide you that transactional volume in a given year as well.
Okay. That all makes a whole lot of sense. Now let's dig into the SAQs for a moment, and I think that this is I'm thinking about the D just because that's what I seem to have the most relevant experience with, but it may be applicable to some of the other ones as well too. I've noticed a big difference between 3.2 and 4.0, and that is if you say yes in one of those columns, it now requires you to say why did you say yes, as opposed to you're just saying yes. Now,
Correct.
the SAQD is a rather lengthy document. I think there's more than 300 requirements there. I understand the spirit of what they're asking for, and you can dig deep into this, and you can really, really go down a rabbit hole. But pragmatically, I mean, realistically, what is expected there? Can you be as generic and say, see information security policy or program or something like that? Or do you have to specifically say in the information security policy, section D, subsection 4, II, here's the line that it states? I guess what I'm asking is that how granular is the expectation for someone not undergoing a QSA, but someone filling out an SAQ?
Right. Good question there. As far as those requirements, giving a little bit of background between 3.2.1 and 4.0 requirements, there is that new requirement where you must go into detailed testing. There are expected testing requirements that are established in SAQD for service providers that you must complete. For example, you got, obviously those 370 plus requirements that you now must be completing. Some of those could also be a future data requirement. There's some new requirements that are future dated, which would become effective after the 31st of March, 2025. So this next year. With those requirements, you can choose to adopt them early, or you can wait till later, obviously, on some of those, just to give a little bit of background there. But within, the PCI DSS requirements, they state, they go through a series of questions like, for example, do you have a formal process to approve and test network connections and changes to your firewall and those router configurations? So, for example, there, um, understanding what that process entails. Do you know what that is? So, if you don't know what that is, the PCI DSS standard gives you expected testing. For example, you need to review your documented process. What are some of those documented processes that an organization may have? You might have policies and procedures to approve and test, firewall changes. You got router configuration changes. What is your change control process around that? So you might have policies and procedures and documented processes around change control and how things are approved and managed in your environment. Secondly, there are some of these requirements may require you to interview certain personnel. For example, you'll interview people within the infrastructure team, network security team that might be administering those systems and implementing those changes. Also, even just looking at system configurations, you're going to be looking at those firewall rule sets and understanding what has been changed. So you may have change control processes in place. You might have file integrity monitoring in place, even detecting those changes that may occur within your infrastructure as well.
If you have a business that this is completely overwhelming to them, and yet they may not reach the level of needing a QSA, would it be, though, possible, and if so, advisable, to engage with an outside firm who specializes in this, whether it be like a firm or a consultant or something, to help them through it? Because this almost sounds like, even if they're doing it themselves, that this is the weight of a major audit. And I feel that a lot of organizations just can't simply handle that in-house. Is that something that's done in the industry? Like, for example, I mean, could I go to you and say, you as a QSA, it's like, well, we don't really need a QSA, but we need a gap analysis. We need help filling out this SAQ. Is that done in the industry?
Yes, it is actually. We see that a lot in the industry, and I've worked with various QSA companies, worked for a couple in my career as well. We do provide, have provided those types of advisory services, so you can look at QSA companies through the PCI Security Standards Council's website. Look at the list of QSA companies that are out there, and they can provide you that guidance and support that you would need, obviously as a small, medium business owner, to advise you, and they could perform like a gap analysis, like you're mentioning, to evaluate where some areas that you might not be, compliant with, or guide and advise you how to complete that form, or even actually complete that on your behalf as well, and attest to your environment as a part of that attestation. Typically, you can perform a gap analysis up front, identify and fix what those issues and gaps are. And then once obviously those items have been corrected or remediated, then you can actually, perform the final assessment and detailed testing procedures and things like that.
That's awesome advice. I could talk about PCI all day, and I could talk about other things all day too, but we have limited time here. And as I like to tell people, I like to keep it down a little bit, because I know some people like to listen to this while they're on the treadmill, and I will not be the one responsible for you going over time on the treadmill, because otherwise people are going to end up hating me. So I have to ask you, everything here is stressful, and it's stressful to the small business owner. It's stressful in our field too. We have to keep up with changes. Again, the whole discussion about PCI 3.2.1 to 4.0 is just one of gazillions, it seems like, out there. CMMC just becoming finally live, although we've known that what's coming down the pipe for some time. I always encourage everybody on this podcast that they need to take care of themselves first and foremost. And that means stepping away from the stress and doing something that rejuvenates you, that decompresses is sometimes the word that I used to use. Sheryl, what's one of the things that you do to get away from the stresses of our industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, I always look at, things that I enjoy the most. Getting out there, I love being out there in nature, being out there, next to a nice, wonderful creek, being able
Mm.
to do some fly fishing and just experience nature and its beauty. And just kind of, taking that time out, take those weekends out, take an afternoon or evening out, go to a park, go for a walk even down your neighborhood and just kind of decompress and just, get away from the computer and all technology, turn things off and just set that time for you, whatever that might be. If you might do some mindfulness exercises, you might do some meditation, you might do yoga, even for that matter, just to be able to have that balance in and make sure that you are taking care of yourself. That is the most important, obviously, to be sure that you are strong and resilient.
That's great advice. And this is the first, this is like the second time in 2 weeks, and maybe the first time this has happened where I've had a duplication where fishing was mentioned as a relaxing activity. Now I've never done it, but I did find it rather humorous. And at first I kind of stumbled over it last week where we had Kerry Johnson on, and he's a fishing guru, PH fishing. So, and he
Mm-hmm.
said, yeah, well, I like to go fishing. And I'm like, well, yeah. And no, I like to go out on the boat and get away. I got it. I understand it.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I totally agree too with the whole like getting back to nature, just taking a walk in the woods. That's something that I absolutely love to do. What about your future plans? What do you have coming down the pike, so to speak?
So, as far as my future career plans, I'm actually in the market right now looking for, qualified security assessor companies, or even just companies that might need an internal security assessor that has that PCI DSS compliance experience. Also, I'm looking at anything related to governance, risk, and compliance as well within an internal organization. So, if there's anybody out there that knows somebody or that needs somebody that's got that expertise, that's been in this industry for a couple of decades, reach out. Reach out. I'm up on LinkedIn.
And obviously, your expertise is unparalleled based on our conversation, and you possess one of the um, skills that a lot of folks in our industry don't. You can take complicated concepts and distill them down into business terms and simple terms so that there can be real discussions. And I really appreciate that. For example, our conversation about service provider versus merchant, because I know from experience that a lot of folks stumble on that. Sheryl, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on today. I appreciate you coming on and being my 164th conversation on the Virtual CISO Moment.
I appreciate it, Greg. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to assist you today with that.
And I want to finally remind everybody that you can catch the new show on Now Media TV called Tech Talk with Greg Schaefer. If you don't have it on your television, you can get it on Roku or you can watch it on the website. Just go to Now Media TV and look for Tech Talk. And everybody, stay secure.